Hey guys, Tarke and Cat, and this is going to be my ultimate beginner trapper guide. I've designed it in a way that it will work for any type of trap playstyle. We've included trees for all of the different traps. We've included skill sets for all different traps, gearing. We can get on to that stuff later. I've designed it using the new life tap support gem, meaning you get the blood magic playstyle without having any mandatory uniques. This means you never need to worry about any mana issues because of the inherent buffs that traps have. Since traps count as hitting, not you, it means you can run reflect maps. You don't need to worry about leech. You can run every single map mod on this build. No worries. This is perfect for anyone who's either never played traps before or would just like to play traps in either a league start environment, an SSF environment, or just kind of wants to hear me talk about my favorite archetype in Path of Exile. So that's what we're trying to achieve today. I guess we'll now talk about the play start, then later on we'll get into the defenses and whatever. So I've set it up so that there are two different playstyles you can go for. We've got a lightning trap and a fire trap setup. Those are both set up for people who want to play with the big cooldown traps. And they're all about, I want to have double 6 links using a staff. I want to throw this big juicy cooldown trap, which just feels really impactful and really fun to play. That's what those two setups are for. We've then set up the ice trap setup, which is okay, Tarke, traps are cool, I'll play them. But I don't want to be pressing too many buttons, so that is focusing on just using Ice Trap. It doesn't have any supplementary, like, big damage traps. And the big draw of Ice Trap is it freezes enemies. You can freeze tier 16 bosses with very little gear, which makes it a very fun playstyle, and because there are less buttons to press, it's very approachable. And then finally we have Explosive Trap. The Explosive Trap setup is for the people who are playing in a trade league environment, most likely. They don't mind having to farm for Helm Enchant, and they just want to see the biggest damage potential possible, and the biggest damage potential possible you will get from Explosive Trap. So briefly to recap, we have two versions if you want to like fully embrace the trapper archetype using these big juicy cooldown traps. One which is more focused for map clear, which is the lightning trap setup. One which is more focused to single target, which is the fire trap setup. We have the ice trap, which is less buttons please, freezing bosses is fun. And then the big, juicy, single target setup. All good? Cool. So, based on whichever one of those sounded most attractive to you, say you're like, oh, I really like the idea of the freezing thing setup, you would disable all the lightning trap stuff, which is just what I have displayed by default, and you enable all the ice trap stuff. We've included your main skill setup, your auras, your curses and exposure setups. At the bottom, the movement guard skill, Bear Trap Volgrace, this is global. Use this on all of them. Following me so far? Awesome. Finally, one thing I do just need to touch on when it comes to playing random setups here. The gear I've set up is if you were using Lightning Trap. It's very simple though. If, for example, you were playing Ice Trap or Fire Trap, wherever you see lightning damage, change the lightning damage to your appropriate element. So if you're playing with the Fire Trap, change the lightning to the fire. Cool. We're all following each other? Great. So we've included some early leveling trees, some mid leveling trees, late leveling trees, and then obviously your end game setups. So now that we've covered all the core basics of the guide, we can now talk about the defenses of the build, the perks of the build, and all of that good stuff. Awesome. So we're a Saboteur. Why did we pick Saboteur for this? There are actually other really good Trapper Ascendancies. I'm currently playing a Raider Trapper. However, they're much more dependent on specific niche, unique, weird interactions. They're not that great to level early on, and it's something you kind of want to swap into. Saboteur just does a lot more damage. The Sab version of the build that I'm currently playing does 25% more damage, meaning it's much less dependent on gear. It will always do more single target damage. You'll have an easier time leveling with it, and it functions at all parts of the game without requiring any mandatory uniques. So, you get Born in the Shadows, which gives you global blind, both to nearby enemies and enemies you hit, and reduced damage taken from blinded enemies. This is an incredibly strong defensive node. This is an evasion-based build, so we get hit way less often thanks to this one node, and you get the damage reduction when you do get hit. Pyromaniac gives you immunity to Ignite and Shock, and 10% life regen, which is how we sustain our life tap, our blood magic costs. Very strong. Perfect Crime gives you damage for each trap you have active. chance of traps to trigger an additional time, and reduced cost of skills that throw traps, which again makes sustaining our blood magic much easier. Explosive Expert is critical strike multiplier against burning enemies, critical strike chance against shocked enemies, and damage penetrates against chilled enemies. You take Explosive Expert on all of the setups except for the Fire Trap. For the Fire Trap, I do swap that for Chain Reaction, just because with Fire Trap you really need the AoE for the skill to feel good, and the cooldown recovery rate on Flamethrower Trap feels really good for single target. But for every other setup, just use Explosive Expert because it just gives so much damage. It just feels good. Cool. So, matching in with the defenses that we get from the Ascendancy, from the Blinding and the Regen, all setups have just under 6k life. You can see 5.9, 5.9, 5.9, 5.9. Cool. So you've got like 6k life basically on a very budget setup in just rares with tier 2 life across the board. So very easy to replicate. You've got Acrobatics, Phase Acrobatics. You've got Wind Dancer. You've got damage reduction. You've got blind stuff. You've got very mobile playstyle. If you're playing either the Lightning Trap or the Fire Trap setup, you've got these 2 big 6-link cooldown traps that you can throw down, and they will control the zone because they last like 4 seconds. I mean, you can just focus on dodging. So you throw those down, and you can just focus on dodging, not getting hit. If you go against a big scary boss and you're a bit scared of the boss, just focus on maintaining your big cooldown traps, and you can focus on moving. If you're playing the Ice Trap setup, you have the added defense of you freeze everything. And if you're playing the Explosive Trap setup, you have the added defense of I kill everything. So, cool. You can see that each setup kind of has its pros and its cons. Finally, just to recap it, because I don't want to be talking about this again, Lightning Trap has the best map clear of all of the skills. Lightning Spire Trap does respectable damage, but it isn't as crazy as Flamethrower Trap. Fire Trap, Flamethrower Trap will have the best single target damage of these like cooldown trap playstyles. Fire Trap does have worst clear, and you are dependent on having to take Chain Reaction for Fire Trap to really feel good. Ice Trap has very good single target damage, has less buttons to press, and will freeze everything. So you press less buttons, you freeze things at a defense. Cool. Explosive Trap does the most damage, but is required Helm Enchants, has slightly different gear stuff going for it, really needs the plus level of gems to feel good, and it has the worst visual clutter of all of the abilities. So while Explosive Trap is the most like offensive trap, I play it the least because I don't like the visual clutter of it. Hope that all makes sense. Right. Finally, you just enable whichever ones we want to use. So if you are playing Fire Trap, disable this, do Fire Trap, Aura, Flamethrower Trap, Curse Exposure. If you're doing the Ice Trap, Auras, Curse Exposure. Explosive Trap, Auras, they use a Flamethrower Trap. It's mostly just to debuff enemies and their Explosive Trap, Curse, and Exposure setups. Cool. Let's talk about the gearing. So, both the Lightning Trap and the Fire Trap uses a staff. Here is an example of a starter staff. For your starter weapons, you want tier 3 spell damage, tier 3 of the appropriate added damage, tier 3 crit chance. An example of your endgame weapon would be spell damage, flat damage of the appropriate type, crit chance, multi, plus all damage to spell gems. I just made even the chase weapon tier 3 rolls because it's unrealistic that you're going to get this like amazing 6 tier 1 item. When it comes to how do you go about getting these items, like how would you get them? Honestly, the starter version, which is just spell damage, a flat damage appropriate type, and spell crit chance, this is the sort of stuff that you just ID. If you actually keep the crit chance staves on your filter and you're just picking them up, you will pick up a spell damage, flat damage to spells, or a spell damage crit chance, and then you just go to the bench and you craft the one you're missing. If you're having absolutely zero luck just picking up a very basic starter version, this is when essences would come in. Essences are incredibly important. You can use essences to force tier 1 or higher. You can get spell damage, you can force flat damage, you can force crit chance stuff. So check your stash, see what essence you have, pick up a staff, and just throw some in there, and then just make do with the best that you can get. But honestly, it's going to be a case of picking items up off the ground to get your starter one going for you, and then chasing some essences, and then you could eventually look into the harvest crafting side of things, but really just essences will be enough to get you going. For your helmet, and this is true of just basically everything across the board, tier 2 life is the minimum. If you can get tier 2 life and then the evasion life roll, you're laughing. Get resists where appropriate, you need to be capping out your resists. Also, all versions of this build requires strength on 2 pieces of gear. I just filled them in on the rings, but you will need strength on 2 pieces of gear. Keep a mind on that. For the chest piece to start off with, I'd recommend just getting a evasion chest piece with tier 2 life and then crafting dodge on it. If you're having 0 luck getting random 6 links, then there's nothing wrong with just using a tabula to start with. But you would want to upgrade your tabula into a rare chest piece. You would eventually then want to upgrade your chest piece into a kintsugi. You could go crazy with influence items for damage and stuff. I honestly think that kintsugi is just such a defensively strong item. It has such great synergy that just getting this one piece will be much cheaper than crafting some crazy influence-based thing. That's more for min-max builds. This is about a build for you copy this setup, you can do all the content. That's the goal of this, right? Really good defense. The less damage taken if you haven't been hit recently. This scales alongside Wind Dancer, and both of these work against damage over time effects. So you actually become very resistant to damage over time effects. And with the combined damage reduction from Wind Dancer, Kintsugi, and Born in the Shadows, you're very resistant to one-shots. This becomes a very tanky build when you get that setup going. For gloves, tier 2 life, evasion life, get in any resist possible. You can mess around with the idea of running shaper gloves and getting into influence stuff, but again, we're trying to focus on the core fundamentals for this build. Its zero step, I think, is the only mandatory unique because of how easy it is to obtain its zero step. Its zero step drops from its zero herself. It's a fairly common drop. If you get really unlucky, you might kill it 10 times. Sacrifice fragments are fairly common. Get the 4 sacrifice fragments, throw them in your map device, kill it zero, drop in its zero step. Feels good, man. I also think the 120% increased crit chance if you haven't crit recently is kind of a mandatory craft at this point. So with the changes to Labyrinth, you see what enchants you get before you do them. Get yourself a pair of its zero step. Force this craft on there. There are other enchants which are situationally better, but I actually really like recommending this to everyone just as a base standard. Because the traps hit and not you never crit. The only skill you have in your entire setup which can temporarily turn this effect off is your Wave of Conviction Curse on Hit. That you only use against big scary endgame bosses like Maven or Cirrus. Meaning that this boot enchant gives you 120% crit chance for the entire time that you're mapping. This smooths out any low rolls. This means that you never have that case of you throw a set of traps, you get unlucky with your crit, you roll really low, and then you need to throw another set of traps. This just makes your map clear feel so much smoother. Yes, while technically there are other enchants that do more damage, in practice, this will smooth out your playstyle the most. For mapping and for single target, yes, your Wave of Conviction can turn off every now and again, but you're only pressing it like once every 10 seconds, and for the most part, just go for this enchant. It will feel good. This is an example of your starter amulet, which would be just life crit multi. You would then want to swap into a life multi +1 skill gems. This does come from influence. So for lightning, you need a Crusader influence item. For ice, you need a Redeemer influence item. And for fire skill gems, you need a Warlord influence item. For your rings, focus on getting life implicit if you can get that to work for your resistances. You want either a coral ring, or if you can get your hands on them, vermilion rings with minimum tier 2 life, strength somewhere in your gear. And I recommend bench crafting. Adds cold damage, adds lightning damage from the bench. I recommend this setup for all trap setups because this gives just enough cold damage that with a crit and all of your scaling, you will shatter all just normal white enemies. This is great for giving you defense against porcupines, random on death effects. Feels really good, gives you a bit of damage, would highly recommend it. For your belt, again, tier 2 life, and you can benchcraft trap throwing speed. If you can get some cool flask modifiers on your belt, go for it, but that's the core minimum. For your hypnotic jewel, I recommend this setup for every version. Make sure you get flat fire damage to spells here with life. The reason why I recommend this for every single version is this flat fire damage to spells is what enables us to burn. To burn, you need to crit an enemy with some fire damage. Just one roll on all of your setup. So the lightning trap needs it to burn. Fire trap doesn't take this node, but it still wants fire damage to spells because that gives it the most damage because it's fire scaling. The ice trap wants it to enable this. You get the idea, right? You want the flat fire there. For jewels, if you can get better than this, great, but as a minimum, you're looking for 7% life and then global critical strike multiplier. If you can get more damage, great. If you can get trap throwing speed, great, but that is the bare minimum. So that was the setup for both lightning trap and fire trap. For ice trap, because you're not using a big cooldown trap in a double 6 link, just go for double daggers. So for the double daggers, it would be spell damage, add the appropriate damage type. So for ice trap, it'd be cold damage, crit chance of spells, global multi, plus level of cold skull gems. For the explosive trap setup, you use a chase dagger and you use the Churn and Bog shield. The Churn and Bog shield gives you 25% of fizz converted to fire. You need the Churn and Bog shield and the anointing of Divine Fury to get 100% fizz to fire conversion for your explosive trap. But it's well worth it. It's very strong, giving that full conversion. It gives you a nice chunk of life, and it gives you enfeeble on hit, which is really strong. You can overwrite this for bossing if you want to, with your Wave of Conviction setup, or if you don't really want to worry about that and you just want the enfeeble all the time, then it's just very good defensive. For your flasks, run a Quicksilver Flask of Adrenaline. You have to do that. There's no ifs or buts. Jade Flask of Reflexes. If you were to drop any of these flasks for a DPS flask, this would be the one that you would drop, but I recommend keeping it. It will make you feel much, much tankier. But if you happen to get your hands on a Bottled Faith or something, this would be the flask to drop. A Quartz Flask of Heat. This is crucial. It gives you phasing. Phasing lets you run through enemies. This is very nice for the trap playstyle. It also gives you a good chunk of dodge and spell dodge. A Diamond Flask. Diamond Flask you need to get the lucky crit chance. Gives you a big chunk of damage. And it's also worth noting that I didn't have crit chance enabled for the base PvP of this because I don't like just padding numbers for the sake of padding numbers. And then for your Life Flask, you've actually got two options. Either use a Seething Life Flask of Staunching, or you can get away with using Panic Flasks because low life now counts at 50%. This will give you a much bigger instant heal when you reach that 50% threshold, but you have to wait for that 50% threshold. Otherwise, just using a Seething. Make sure you go Alira for your bandits. For your Pantheon, I recommend Soul of Lunaris. This gives you physical damage reduction, which is strong because we're an evasion-based character. It gives you movement speed. It gives you a chance to avoid projectiles. And it gives you 5% dodge and spell dodge if we've been hit recently, which is very nice. The avoid projectiles that have changed doesn't really matter, but those first three are very, very tasty. And then I really like Soul of Raslava as my minor Pantheon. This gives us Life Flask Sustain on bosses, and it gives 60% increased life recovery from Flask when used on low life, which that's 60% increased life recovery. And then we have 70% life recovery on the tree, and Life Tap gives a bonus 20% life recovery from flasks. So at low life, that's 150% flask recovery, meaning you press that flask, you will heal to full every time. If you've got any questions about this build, leave them down below. And finally, in the notes, I did include some early game links, and I also included some information for your loot filters. Very simply, just to go over it, you want to show all tier 1 to tier 3 evasion helmet, gloves, chests, and boot bases. Once you've got your 0 step, you can disable boots from your filter. If you get your hands on a Kintsugi, you can disable chests from your filter. Keep the evasion gloves and helmet on there. Great. For weapons, I would show all rune dagger bases and all crit implicit staves. The reason why I would recommend showing all of them, even if you are playing, for example, the ice trap setup and you don't want to be using staves, it's still worth having them on there because you never know. You might ID into an absolutely amazing lightning trap stave, for example, and then you're like, actually, I want to try that out. And with how similar these trees are, it's actually incredibly easy to swap between them. And they all actually have very different playstyles. You would be surprised at how differently they play, even though, you know, at a glance, they look basically identical. You're like, but Tarke, how can Fire Trap and Lightning Trap play differently? They've got like a 4-point difference in their skill tree, and they change one Ascendancy node. You really do notice the difference between having that big Nova versus that big Flamethrower single target. But yeah, if you've got any questions, let me know. And super finally, if you're lucky enough to get your hands on a Slave Driver's Hand, screw you, but that would be your end game item, and then you would drop Life Tap from your links for a damage link. But yes, I'm Tarke. Have a good day. Let me know if this was helpful. Bye-bye.